Oklahoma wasn't where I thought I'd find love, but life is strange that way. I was 27 when I moved to Norman, following a job opportunity that seemed better on paper than it turned out to be in reality. The apartment I'd found was in a converted duplex on the east side of town, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough that you could hear your neighbor's television through the shared wall, and the air conditioning unit rattled like it was trying to escape through the window. But it was mine. And after years of sharing cramped spaces with college roommates who left pizza boxes stacked on counters for weeks and played video games until dawn, the solitude felt like a luxury I'd forgotten I craved. Even if that solitude came with the particular weight of being the only person I knew in a state that felt foreign despite sharing the same language, the same currency, the same basic understanding of how things worked. The mechanic shop where I worked was called Riley's Auto, though Riley himself had been dead for 15 years according to the current owner. A weathered man named Frank who chain-smoked Marlboros and spoke in half-sentences that somehow conveyed everything you needed to know. The garage bay doors faced west, which meant that every afternoon the shop became an oven that no amount of industrial fans could cool, and by closing time my coveralls were soaked through with sweat and motor oil. It was honest work, though. There was something satisfying about diagnosing a problem, the subtle knock in an engine that meant worn bearings, the particular whine of a transmission that was about to give up, and then fixing it with your hands, making something broken whole again. It was more than I could say for most of the jobs I'd had since graduating with a degree in English that had proven to be worth slightly less than the paper it was printed on. The morning Tyler first walked into the shop, I was underneath a '98 Honda Civic, wrestling with a stubborn oil drain plug that had been over-tightened by someone who clearly believed that if some torque was good, more torque was better. I heard the bell above the front door chime, heard Frank's gruff voice greeting someone, but I was focused on the task at hand, my socket wrench slipping for the third time in as many minutes. When I finally freed the plug and rolled out from under the car, wiping my hands on a shop rag that had seen better days, I caught my first glimpse of him through the office window. Tall, maybe 6'1", with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it and clothes that marked him as someone who worked outside. Faded jeans with honest wear marks, boots that had walked through more than parking lots, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were corded with muscle and marked with small scars that spoke of a life lived with his hands. He was holding the hand of a small boy, maybe 7 or 8, who was looking around the garage with the wide-eyed curiosity that children brought to places full of interesting smells and mysterious tools. The resemblance between them was unmistakable. The same dark hair, the same serious brown eyes, the same way of standing with one hip cocked slightly to the side. "Transmission's making a hell of a noise," I heard Tyler tell Frank, his voice carrying a slight accent that placed him somewhere south of here, maybe Texas or Arkansas. "Started about a week ago, getting worse every day." Frank nodded, making notes on a work order with a pencil that looked like it had been sharpened with a pocket knife. "Leave it with us, we'll take a look. Probably need it overnight, though." "That's fine. My neighbor can give us a ride home." It was then that the boy tugged on Tyler's hand, pointing toward the garage bay where I was standing. "Dad, can I see the cars?" Tyler followed his son's gaze, and our eyes met for the first time through the office window. The eye contact lasted only a moment, long enough for me to register that his eyes were the color of coffee, warm and deep, before I looked away, suddenly self-conscious about my oil-stained coveralls and the grease under my fingernails. "Maybe some other time, buddy," Tyler said gently, ruffling the boy's hair. "The mechanics are busy." But the boy was already walking toward me, drawn by the kind of magnetic curiosity that made children brave in ways adults had forgotten how to be. Tyler followed, one hand extended as if he might need to grab his son and retreat, an apologetic smile already forming on his lips. "Sorry," he said as they approached. "Cody's fascinated by engines. Are you okay with him looking around, or should I—" "It's fine," I said quickly, then cleared my throat when my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "I mean, he can look. Just don't touch anything sharp." Cody grinned up at me, gap-toothed and fearless. "What's wrong with that one?" he asked, pointing to the Honda I'd been working on. "Oil change," I said, then found myself explaining the process, why cars needed oil, how it got dirty, why it was important to change it regularly. As I talked, I noticed Tyler listening too, his attention focused and genuine in a way that made something flutter in my chest. "You know a lot about cars," Tyler observed when I finished my impromptu lesson. "It's my job," I said, then immediately felt stupid for stating the obvious. "Still," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. "Not everyone who works on cars can explain it so a kid can understand. That's a gift." The compliment caught me off guard, heat rising in my cheeks in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the garage. I busied myself with wiping my hands again, though they were already clean. "Dad, can we get a milkshake?" Cody asked, tugging on Tyler's hand again. "After we get home and you finish your homework," Tyler replied automatically, then looked back at me. "Thanks for letting him look around." "I'm Tyler, by the way, Tyler Morrison, and this is Cody." "Jamie," I said, shaking his offered hand. His grip was firm and calloused, warm despite the cold morning, and when he smiled, really smiled, not just the polite version he'd been wearing, it transformed his entire face. "Nice to meet you, Jamie." They left a few minutes later, Tyler's information written on a work order that Frank clipped to a board near the cash register. I watched through the office window as they walked to the curb where a beat-up sedan was waiting, Tyler's hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. That afternoon, when I pulled the transmission pan on Tyler's truck, a '05 Ford F-150 with more miles on it than seemed possible, I found metal shavings mixed with the fluid that told the story of a transmission that was dying by degrees. It was expensive to fix, the kind of expensive that meant choosing between rent and transportation for most people, and I found myself hoping Tyler was one of the lucky ones who had savings set aside for emergencies. He wasn't, of course. When I called with the estimate the next morning, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "How long before it completely gives out?" he asked finally. I looked at the work order, thought about the metal shavings, the way the truck had sounded when he'd limped it into the shop. "Hard to say. Could be a week, could be a month. But once it goes, you'll be looking at a tow truck." Another silence. "And there's no way to, I don't know, patch it? Make it last a little longer?" The question told me everything I needed to know about Tyler's financial situation, and I found myself doing something I'd never done before, offering a payment plan that Frank definitely hadn't authorized. "Let me talk to my boss," I said. "See if we can work something out." Frank, surprisingly, agreed. Maybe it was the way I explained Tyler's situation, or maybe it was because business had been slow and he needed the work. Either way, when Tyler came to pick up his truck 3 days later, we'd arranged for him to pay half up front and the rest over the next 2 months. "I really appreciate this," Tyler said as he signed the paperwork, Cody coloring with crayons at a small table Frank kept in the office for customers with kids. "You didn't have to go to bat for me like that." "It's no big deal," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. I'd spent the better part of 3 days thinking about him. The worry in his eyes when I'd given him the estimate, the careful way he'd spoken to his son, the strength in his hands when we'd shaken hello. "It is to me," Tyler said quietly, and when he looked at me, I felt that flutter in my chest again, stronger this time. Over the next few weeks, Tyler's truck became a regular visitor to the shop. Nothing major, an oil change, a brake inspection, small maintenance items that could have been done anywhere but that he brought to us. To me, specifically, asking for me by name when he called to schedule appointments. I told myself it was because he trusted my work, which was probably true. But there was something else. Something in the way he lingered after I finished whatever repair he'd brought the truck in for. The way our conversations gradually moved from purely mechanical topics to more personal ones. I learned that he worked construction, mostly residential framing, That he'd moved to Norman from Little Rock 3 years ago for a job that had lasted exactly 6 months before the housing market took a downturn and left him scrambling for work. I learned that he'd been married once, to a woman named Sarah who'd left when Cody was 4 because she'd decided she wasn't cut out for motherhood after all. Just packed up one day while Cody was at daycare, Tyler told me one afternoon while I changed the air filter in his truck. Left a note saying she was sorry but she couldn't do it anymore. Haven't heard from her since. The pain in his voice when he talked about it made something tight and protective unfurl in my chest. That must have been hard on both of you. Cody doesn't really remember her, Tyler said. Sometimes I think that's a blessing. But sometimes I wonder if it would be easier if he had a mom, you know? Someone who could help with the things I'm not good at. Like what? Tyler was quiet for a moment, watching me work. I don't know. Girl stuff, if he ever has questions. Or even boy stuff, really. I'm making it up as I go along most of the time. I think most parents are, I said, though I had no experience to base that on. Maybe. But most parents have each other to figure it out with. I've got Google and YouTube and a lot of crossed fingers. The vulnerability in his admission made me look up from the engine bay, meeting his eyes across the hood of the truck. There was something raw there. Something that spoke to a loneliness I recognized because I carried it too, in different form but with the same weight. You're doing fine, I said, meaning it. Cody's a good kid. Happy, polite, curious about the world. That doesn't happen by accident. Tyler's smile was soft, grateful. Thanks. Sometimes I wonder if I'm screwing him up, you know? Single dad in a conservative state. No family nearby to help out. It's not exactly the American dream. There's no manual for this stuff, I said, closing the hood and wiping my hands on my coveralls. But from what I can see, you're putting him first, and that's what matters. It was true, though I didn't mention that I'd been watching them together, noting the way Tyler always made sure Cody was safely away from any moving parts before he started the truck. The way he listened patiently to his son's endless questions about how engines worked, the easy affection between them that spoke of a relationship built on genuine love rather than obligation. "Can I ask you something?" Tyler said as I finished up the paperwork. I nodded, suddenly nervous for reasons I couldn't articulate. You ever think about having kids? The question caught me completely off guard. I'd been expecting something about the truck or maybe about the bill, not something so personal, so loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. No, not really, I said finally, which was both true and not true. I'd thought about it in abstract terms, the way most people did, but always in the context of some hypothetical future that involved meeting the right person and settling down and doing all the things that people were supposed to do. But the right person had never materialized. And settling down felt like something that happened to other people, people who were better at connection, better at letting others close enough to build a life with. That's probably smart, Tyler said. It's terrifying, having someone depend on you completely. Knowing that every decision you make affects another person, maybe for the rest of their life. But you wouldn't change it? Not for anything, Tyler said without hesitation. Even on the hard days, even when I feel like I have no idea what I'm doing, I wouldn't change it. He's the best thing I've ever done. There was something in the way he said it, a fierce protectiveness mixed with wonder that made me understand why some people chose to become parents despite all the risks and complications. It also made me wonder what it would feel like to love someone that completely, that unconditionally. After they left, I found myself thinking about that conversation for the rest of the day, turning it over in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. There had been something underneath Tyler's questions, something that felt like he was trying to figure me out the same way I was trying to figure him out. It was a dangerous line of thinking, though, so I pushed it aside and focused on the work in front of me, a transmission rebuild on a 03 Chevy that was going to take the better part of a week. But Tyler kept coming back, and our conversations kept getting longer, more personal. I learned that he'd grown up on a farm outside Little Rock, that he'd played football in high school but wasn't good enough for college, that he'd learned construction from his father and his grandfather before him. I learned that he read fantasy novels in his spare time, the kind with dragons and magic systems that required charts to follow, and that he was teaching Cody to play guitar on an instrument he'd bought at a pawn shop. In return, I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone, about growing up in a small town in Kansas where being different in any way marked you as a target, about studying English in college because I'd loved books, but having no idea what to do with that love in the real world, about the loneliness of moving to a new state where I didn't know anyone and wasn't sure how to meet people. "What made you choose Norman?" Tyler asked one afternoon. We were sitting in the office, waiting for his truck to finish getting an inspection, Cody absorbed in a coloring book at the small table. "The job, mostly," I said. "And I guess I wanted to go somewhere I'd never been. Start fresh." "How's that working out for you?" I considered the question. Norman was fine, a college town with enough going on to keep from feeling completely isolated, close enough to Oklahoma City that I could drive there if I needed to feel like part of something larger. But it wasn't home. Not in any way that mattered. "It's okay," I said finally. "Still figuring out where I fit." "I know that feeling," Tyler said quietly. There was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely, but before I could ask what he meant, Cody looked up from his coloring book. "Dad, can Jamie come over for dinner sometime?" The question hung in the air between us, innocent from Cody but loaded with implications that made my heart race. Tyler's cheeks flushed slightly, and he opened his mouth to deflect the invitation in that polite way parents did when their children said things that crossed social boundaries. "That's up to Jamie, buddy," he said carefully. I could have made an excuse, should have made an excuse. Dinner at Tyler's house with his son felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross, moving from the safe territory of professional friendliness into something more personal, more complicated. "I'd like that," I heard myself say. Tyler's smile was surprised and pleased, and something warm unfurled in my chest at the sight of it. "Great," he said. "How about Saturday?" "Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and whatever vegetables I can trick Cody into eating." "That sounds perfect." Saturday came with the kind of unseasonable warmth that Oklahoma specialized in. 70 degrees in late October, the trees still holding on to their leaves like they weren't quite ready to admit that winter was coming. Tyler's house was in an older neighborhood near the university, a small ranch-style home with a front porch that sagged slightly and a yard that needed mowing. I sat in my car for a few minutes before knocking, trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building all day. This was just dinner with a friend, I told myself. 2 adults and a kid sharing a meal, nothing more complicated than that. But when Tyler opened the door, wearing jeans and a blue button-down shirt that brought out the color of his eyes, I felt that familiar flutter in my chest and knew I was lying to myself. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let me pass. "Cody's been asking about you all day." The inside of the house was small but comfortable, clearly the home of someone who'd furnished it gradually with pieces that served a function rather than making a statement. The living room held a couch that had seen better days, a coffee table covered with Cody's homework and art projects, and a television that was currently showing cartoons at a volume that made conversation difficult. "Cody, turn that down," Tyler called, then looked at me apologetically. "Sorry, he gets focused on things and forgets the rest of the world exists." "It's fine," I said, meaning it. There was something warm about the chaos, the lived-in feeling that came from a house that was actually a home rather than just a place to sleep. Dinner was exactly what Tyler had promised: spaghetti with meat sauce, green beans that Cody picked around with surgical precision, and garlic bread that was probably frozen, but tasted homemade in the way that mattered. We ate at a small table in the kitchen, Cody chattering about school and his friends and a book he was reading about dinosaurs. "Did you know that T-Rex probably had feathers?" he asked me seriously. "Like not all over, but some, and they might have been different colors, like peacocks. I didn't know that, I said, genuinely interested. That's pretty cool. Cody's going through a dinosaur phase, Tyler explained. Everything has to be scientifically accurate or he'll correct you. They're not just big lizards, Cody said with the authority of someone who'd done his research. That's what people used to think, but they were wrong. Dinosaurs were more like birds. I found myself drawn into the conversation despite my usual shyness around children. Cody was bright and curious, the kind of kid who asked questions that made you think, who listened to the answers with genuine interest rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. After dinner, Tyler sent Cody to take a bath while we cleaned up, and the sudden quiet felt charged with possibility. We worked in comfortable silence, Tyler washing dishes while I dried, our hands occasionally brushing as we passed plates back and forth. "Thanks for coming," Tyler said as we finished the last of the silverware. "Cody doesn't get many visitors." "Hell, neither do I, really." "Thanks for having me," I said. "It's nice to have somewhere to go that isn't work or my empty apartment." Tyler dried his hands on a dish towel, then leaned against the counter facing me. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, though something in his tone made me nervous. "Are you happy here?" In Norman, I mean. Because sometimes when you talk about it, you sound like you're just marking time. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I thought I wanted to start over somewhere new, but maybe I just brought all my old problems with me." "What kind of problems?" The question was gentle, but it opened up territories I wasn't sure I wanted to explore. "How did you explain to someone that you'd spent most of your life feeling like you were watching other people live their lives from the outside? How did you admit that you'd never had a serious relationship because you'd never figured out how to let anyone close enough?" I struggled for words. "I don't know how to be around people, I guess. How to make friends, how to belong somewhere. I'm good at being alone, but I'm starting to think maybe that's not the same thing as being happy." Tyler was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with those warm brown eyes. "You seem fine to me," he said finally. "Around people, I mean. You're good with Cody, and he doesn't warm up to everyone that quickly." "Kids are easier," I said. "They don't have expectations about who you're supposed to be." "Maybe adults are the problem then." There was something in the way he said it that made me look at him more closely. "Speaking from experience?" Tyler's smile was rueful. "Something like that. I've never been good at fitting in either. Too quiet for some people, too serious for others. And now that I'm a single dad, I'm in this weird category where I don't fit with the married couples, but I don't fit with the single guys either." "That sounds lonely." "It is, sometimes. But then I meet someone who gets it, and it doesn't feel so bad." The way he was looking at me when he said it made my pulse quicken. There was something intentional about his words, something that felt like an invitation or a confession or both. Before I could respond, Cody appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing pajamas covered with dinosaurs, his hair damp from his bath. "Dad, can you read to me?" "Of course, buddy." "Go pick out a book and I'll be there in a minute." After Cody left, Tyler and I stood there in the kitchen, the air between us heavy with things unsaid. I knew I should leave, should thank him for dinner and go home to my empty apartment and pretend this evening had been just what it appeared to be on the surface. "I should probably go," I said, though every cell in my body was protesting the idea. Tyler nodded, but he didn't move to walk me to the door. Instead, he took a step closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woodsy and warm that made me want to breathe deeper. "Jamie," he said quietly, and my name sounded different in his voice, more significant somehow. "Yeah?" For a moment I thought he was going to say something that would change everything between us, something that would make this evening mean what I was desperately hoping it meant. But then Cody called from the living room, "Dad, I picked 3 books!" And the spell was broken. "I should go read to him," Tyler said, stepping back. "Of course," I said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. He walked me to the front door, and we stood there for a moment in the porch light, neither of us quite ready to say goodnight. A cool breeze had picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. "Thanks again for dinner," I said. "It was really nice." "We should do it again sometime," Tyler said, and there was a question in his voice that I desperately wanted to answer. "I'd like that." He smiled, and I felt that flutter in my chest again, stronger now, mixed with something that felt dangerous and wonderful and terrifying all at once. "Drive safe," he said. I was halfway down the front steps when he called my name. When I turned back, he was still standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from inside the house. "You don't have to go yet," he said softly, his voice barely carrying across the small distance between us. "If you don't want to." The words hung in the air like a bridge I could either cross or burn. I could see something vulnerable in his expression, something that matched the hope and fear that was currently making my heart race. Behind him, I could hear Cody calling for his dad, the normal sounds of a family evening carrying on. But Tyler didn't move, didn't break eye contact, just waited for my answer with the kind of patience that suggested he understood exactly how much weight this moment carried. I stood there at the bottom of his front steps, keys in my hand, the engine of my car still ticking as it cooled, and felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The smart thing would be to get in my car and drive home, to keep things simple and safe and uncomplicated. But as I looked at Tyler, really looked at him, at the hope in his eyes and the careful way he was holding himself, like he was prepared for rejection but brave enough to risk it anyway, I realized that safe wasn't what I wanted anymore. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and the weight of choices that would change everything. The words hung in the air between us like heat lightning. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." I sat there on his front porch, my truck keys growing warm in my palm, watching the way the streetlight caught the uncertainty in his eyes. Tyler had always been careful with his words, measured in the way that comes from having too much to lose. But tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, he was asking me to stay. The Oklahoma sky was building towards something. I could feel it in the way the air pressed against my skin, thick and electric. Storm season in Norman meant you learned to read the signs, the stillness that wasn't really still, the way the leaves turned their backs to show their pale undersides, the distant rumble that could be thunder or could be the freight trains that cut through town at all hours. "I should check on Mason first," Tyler said quietly, though he didn't move to get up. "Make sure he's really asleep." I nodded, understanding. Everything in Tyler's life was filtered through that 6-year-old boy sleeping inside. Every decision, every risk, every moment of possible happiness weighed against the fierce protectiveness that had shaped him since the divorce. It was one of the things I'd grown to love about him, even as it sometimes felt like a wall between us. He stood and slipped inside, leaving me alone with the approaching storm. I could hear his footsteps moving softly through the house, the gentle creak of a bedroom door opening and closing. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, still miles away but getting closer. I thought about leaving, about climbing into my truck and driving home to my empty apartment above the auto parts store. It would be easier, safer, less complicated. But Tyler had asked me to stay. When he came back, he settled beside me on the porch swing, closer than before. The chain creaked softly under our combined weight, a sound that had become as familiar to me as the rhythm of his breathing. "He's out cold," Tyler said, and there was relief in his voice. "That boy could sleep through a tornado." "Speaking of which," I said, nodding toward the sky, "looks like we might get some weather." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "You could wait it out. Inside, I mean, if you want." It was the second invitation, gentler than the first, but somehow carrying more weight. I looked at him, really looked, taking in the way the porch light shadowed the angles of his face, The nervous energy in the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, the hope he was trying not to show. "Tyler," I said, his name feeling different in my mouth than it had an hour ago. More significant. More fragile. "Are you sure about this?" "Sure about what?" But we both knew what I was asking. I was asking about the space between friendship and something more, about the careful distance we'd been maintaining for months, about what it might mean if we stopped pretending we were just two guys who happened to spend all our free time together. "I don't know," he admitted, and his honesty cut through me like a blade. "I don't know what I'm sure about anymore. But I know I don't want you to drive home in a storm, and I know I'm tired of watching you leave every night and wondering what it would be like if you didn't." The thunder was getting closer now, and with it came the first fat drops of rain, hitting the dusty yard with small explosions of scent. Petrichor, my high school English teacher would have called it, though I'd never had reason to use the word until now. "Okay," I said, the decision made before I fully realized I was making it. "I'll stay." Tyler's shoulders seemed to drop with relief, and he stood, holding the screen door open for me. "Come on, then, before we both get soaked." Inside, his house felt different at night. Smaller, more intimate. The living room was still cluttered with Mason's toys and homework papers, but the lamplight softened everything, made it feel like a place where secrets could be shared. Tyler moved around nervously, straightening cushions that didn't need straightening, picking up a coffee mug from the side table. "You want something to drink?" he asked. "I've got beer, or I think there's some of that sweet tea Mason likes." "Beer's good." He disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear him rattling around, opening the refrigerator, fumbling with bottle caps. I used the time to really look at his space. The family photos on the mantel, most of them showing Tyler and Mason at various ages, a few that included a man I assumed was Tyler's ex-husband before things went bad. There was a guitar in the corner that I'd never seen him play, covered in a thin layer of dust. Books stacked on the coffee table, mostly parenting guides and auto repair manuals, but a few novels tucked in between. When he came back, he handed me a bottle of Coors and settled into the opposite end of the couch, leaving space between us that felt both respectful and disappointing. "So," he said, then seemed to run out of words. "So," I agreed. Outside, the storm was picking up in earnest now. Rain hammered against the windows, and lightning flickered with increasing frequency, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the whole house. In Oklahoma, you learn to respect weather like this, the kind that could turn a peaceful evening into something that ended up on the news. "Mason okay with storms?" I asked, nodding toward the hallway. "Loves them, actually. Says they sound like dinosaurs." Tyler smiled, and it was the first natural expression I'd seen from him since we'd come inside. "Last week we sat on the porch and counted lightning strikes until I got too nervous and made him come in. You were probably smart. This feels like it could get serious." "Yeah." Tyler took a long pull from his beer, and I watched the way his throat worked as he swallowed. "Remember that tornado warning we had back in March? When you came over to help me move stuff into the storm shelter?" I remembered. We'd spent 2 hours crammed into that tiny underground space with Mason, playing I Spy and 20 questions while the sirens wailed above us. Mason had fallen asleep against Tyler's shoulder, and I'd found myself watching them in the dim light, thinking about what it might be like to be part of something like that. A family, a unit, people who looked out for each other when the world got dangerous. "That was a long night," I said. "Yeah, but not a bad one." He looked at me across the space between us. "I kept thinking about how natural you were with him. With Mason. How you didn't treat him like he was fragile or something you had to be careful around. He's a good kid." "He is. But that's not what I meant." Tyler set his beer down and turned to face me more directly. "Most people, when they find out I'm a single dad, they either run the other direction or they act like Mason's some kind of obstacle to get around. But you've never done that. From day one, you just accepted us. Both of us. The weight of his words settled over me like the heavy air before a storm breaks. I thought about all the evenings I'd spent here, helping with homework and fixing broken toys and reading bedtime stories in voices that made Mason giggle. I'd told myself I was just being a good friend, just helping out where I could. But Tyler was right. Somewhere along the way, I'd started thinking of them as a package deal, started imagining a future where I belonged in their little family. It was easy, I said quietly, accepting you, both of you. Was it? There was something in his voice that made me look at him more carefully. He was studying me with an intensity that made my chest tight, like he was trying to read something written in a language he wasn't sure he understood. Yeah, I said. It was. The thunder cracked overhead, close enough now that the lights flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, I caught a glimpse of Tyler's face in the lightning flash. Open, vulnerable, beautiful in a way that made my breath catch. "Can I tell you something?" he said when the lights steadied. Of course. I haven't felt this nervous around someone since I was 16. The admission hit me like a physical blow, not because it was surprising, but because it was exactly what I'd been feeling but hadn't known how to name. The careful dance we'd been doing for months, the way conversations would get too close to something real and then veer away at the last second, the electric charge that seemed to fill the air whenever we accidentally touched. It all made sense now. "Tyler," I started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish." "Please." He took a shaky breath. When David and I split up, I thought that was it for me. I thought I'd used up whatever capacity I had for this kind of thing, for feeling this way about someone. And maybe that was okay, you know? Maybe it was better to focus on Mason, on being the kind of father he deserved, instead of risking that kind of pain again. I wanted to reach for him, to close the distance between us, but something in his posture told me he needed to say this, needed to get it all out before he lost his nerve. "But then you showed up," he continued, his voice getting quieter, more uncertain. "With your beat-up truck and your gentle hands and the way you listen to Mason talk about dinosaurs like it's the most important thing in the world. And suddenly I'm feeling things I thought I'd forgotten how to feel, and I'm terrified because I don't know what that means for us, for Mason, for this life I've built that finally feels stable." The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with all the things we'd been dancing around for months. Outside, the storm raged with the kind of fury that reminded you how small you were in the face of forces bigger than yourself. "I'm scared too," I said finally, the words coming out rougher than I'd intended. "Scared because I've never wanted anything as much as I want this, whatever this is. Scared because I know what it's like to be different in a place like Norman, and I don't want that for Mason. Scared because caring about you, caring about him, it feels like standing in a field during a lightning storm." Tyler's eyes met mine across the couch, and in them I saw my own fear reflected back, but also something else, hope, maybe, or just the recognition that we were both tired of pretending. "What if we stopped being scared?" he asked quietly. "Just for tonight. What if we just saw what happened?" It was such a simple question, but it felt revolutionary. What if we stopped calculating risks and analyzing consequences? What if we just let ourselves feel what we'd been feeling, want what we'd been wanting? "I'd like that," I said, and it came out like a confession. Tyler smiled then, and it was different from any smile I'd seen from him before, less guarded, more real. Without breaking eye contact, he scooted closer to me on the couch, closing the careful distance we'd been maintaining. When his knee brushed against mine, I felt the contact like an electric shock. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Yeah," I managed. "This is okay." We sat there for a moment, knees touching, the space between us charged with possibility. I could smell his soap, something clean and masculine, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the freckles across the bridge of his nose that I'd never been close enough to notice before. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up," Tyler said softly. "Like this is too good to be real." "If it's a dream," I said, "then we're both having it." He laughed, a quiet sound that seemed to release some of the tension we'd both been carrying. Without quite meaning to, I found myself reaching out, my fingers brushing against his where they rested on the couch between us. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand palm up, an invitation. I took it. His hand was warm, slightly calloused from years of construction work before Mason was born, before he'd had to find steadier employment. Our fingers interlaced naturally, like puzzle pieces finding their proper places, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't even realized was unsteady. "This is nice," Tyler said, and there was wonder in his voice, like he was surprised by how right it felt. "Yeah," I agreed. "It is." We sat like that for a while, hands joined, watching the lightning paint shadows across the walls. It was such a simple thing, holding hands, something I hadn't done with anyone in years. But with Tyler, it felt significant, like a promise being made without words. "Tell me something," he said eventually. "Something I don't know about you." I thought about it, sifting through the usual stories people told when they were getting to know each other. But this felt different, more important. This felt like it deserved honesty. "I wanted to be a teacher," I said finally. "Back in high school, I thought I'd study history, maybe teach at the community college level. I loved learning about the past, about the stories of people who came before us." "What happened?" "Reality, I guess. Teaching doesn't pay much, especially not in Oklahoma. And when I came out to my parents, they made it pretty clear that they weren't going to help with college anymore. So I learned to fix cars instead, because people always need their cars fixed, and it was something I could do with my hands." Tyler's thumb brushed across my knuckles, a gesture of comfort that seemed unconscious. "Do you regret it?" "Sometimes. Mostly, I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver, if I'd found a way to make it work anyway." I looked at him. This man who'd found the courage to leave a marriage that was making him miserable, who was raising a child as a single parent in a town that didn't always make space for families like his. "What about you? Did you always want to work construction?" "God, no." Tyler smiled ruefully. "I wanted to be a musician. Had this fantasy about moving to Nashville, playing guitar and honky-tonks, maybe writing songs that meant something to people." I glanced toward the dusty guitar in the corner. "You still play?" "Not much. Not since." He trailed off, but I knew he was thinking about the divorce, about the dreams that had gotten lost in the wreckage of a marriage that couldn't survive the weight of secrecy and shame. "Maybe you could start again," I suggested gently. "Maybe." He squeezed my hand. "It's funny how life never turns out the way you think it will when you're young." "Is that good or bad?" "Both, I think." I never thought I'd be a single dad at 33, never thought I'd be starting over again. But I also never thought I'd have Mason. Never thought I'd meet someone who makes me feel like maybe starting over doesn't have to mean settling for less. The weight of his words made my chest tight. I looked at our joined hands, at the way his fingers looked intertwined with mine, and felt something shift inside me. A door opening, a wall crumbling, a decision being made somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "Tyler," I said, his name coming out like a question. "Yeah. Can I kiss you?" The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back. Tyler's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment I thought I'd pushed too far, moved too fast. But then his free hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "I thought you'd never ask," he whispered. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like the dramatic movie moments I'd imagined. It was soft, tentative, a question being asked and answered, Tyler's lips were warm and slightly chapped, and he tasted like beer and something uniquely him. I felt his breath hitch as I deepened the kiss slightly, my hand coming up to rest against his chest where I could feel his heart racing. We pulled apart after a moment, both breathing hard, and I rested my forehead against his. "Wow," Tyler breathed. "Yeah," I agreed, because I couldn't think of anything more eloquent to say. We stayed like that, foreheads touching, sharing the same air, while the storm raged outside. I could feel Tyler trembling slightly, and I realized I was shaking too, not from fear, but from the overwhelming intensity of finally being this close to him. "I should check on Mason," Tyler said eventually, though he made no move to pull away. "Okay." But instead of getting up, he kissed me again, longer this time, with more certainty. His hand tangled in my hair, and I felt myself melting into him, into this moment I'd been dreaming about for months without admitting it to myself. When we broke apart this time, Tyler's eyes were dark with something that made my stomach flip. "I'll be right back," he promised. He slipped away down the hallway, leaving me alone on the couch with my racing heart and the taste of him still on my lips. I could hear him moving quietly through the house, checking locks and turning off lights, the domestic sounds of a man securing his home for the night. When he came back, he'd changed into a t-shirt and sweatpants, and his hair was mussed in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "Mason's fine," he reported. "Dead to the world." "Good." Tyler settled back onto the couch, but this time he sat right beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. Without hesitation, he curled against my side, his head finding the hollow of my shoulder like it belonged there. "Is this okay?" he asked, echoing his question from earlier. "More than okay," I said, wrapping my arm around him, marveling at how perfectly he fit against me. We stayed like that as the storm slowly passed, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Mason's upcoming school play, a problem I was having with a customer at the shop, Tyler's worries about his truck finally giving up completely. Normal things, everyday concerns, but somehow made precious by the intimacy of how we were sharing them. Gradually, the thunder moved off into the distance, and the rain gentled from a downpour to a steady patter against the windows. Tyler's breathing had grown slow and even against my shoulder, and when I looked down, his eyes were closed. "Tyler?" I said softly. You falling asleep?" "Maybe a little." He shifted slightly, getting more comfortable. "Is that okay?" I thought about it, about the implications of spending the night here, about what Mason might think if he woke up and found us on the couch together, about all the ways this could get complicated. Then I thought about how right it felt to have Tyler in my arms, how natural it seemed to hold him while he slept, how this was the first time in years that I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. "Yeah," I said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of his head. "That's okay." Tyler smiled without opening his eyes, and I felt him relax completely against me. Outside, the storm was finally moving on, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and the promise of a clear morning. I closed my own eyes, listening to Tyler's breathing, to the settling sounds of the house around us, to the distant rumble of thunder fading into the Oklahoma night. Tomorrow would bring questions and complications, decisions that would need to be made about what this meant, where we went from here. But tonight, for now, there was just this. Tyler warm and safe in my arms, the storm passing over us, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, we wouldn't face it alone. I was almost asleep when I felt Tyler stir slightly against me. "Hey," he whispered, his voice thick with sleep. "Hey. Thank you for staying. Thank you for asking me to." He was quiet for a moment and then, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hit me like lightning, illuminating everything I'd been too afraid to name. I tightened my arms around him, this brave, beautiful man who'd just handed me his heart with the same careful trust he'd shown me everything else. I think I'm falling in love with you too, I whispered back. Tyler's hand found mine in the darkness, our fingers interlacing the way they had earlier, and I felt something click into place, not just between us, but inside me, in places that had been empty for so long I'd forgotten they were supposed to be full. Outside, the last of the storm clouds were drifting away, revealing patches of starlight. And inside, two men who'd been alone for too long held each other close and dared to hope that sometimes, if you were very lucky, the weather cleared just when you needed it most. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain as Oklahoma weather, full of challenges we couldn't yet imagine. But as I drifted off to sleep with Tyler in my arms, I found I wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. After all, the best storms, the ones that really mattered, were the ones that washed everything clean and left the world new again. And this, whatever it was becoming, felt like the beginning of something that just might be worth weathering any storm for.